I know this is a pilot year, but I think it's going to be a very exciting first year for the Institute. So I'm going to mostly read from a script. Apparently that's what keynotes do. And the title of my talk is Staying with the Problem, Social Design, Practice and Research. And I've kind of stolen the first few words and adapted them from a recent book by Donna Haraway, which is called Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in Toothlullsin. Okay, this Toothlullsin concept is as hard to grasp as it is to pronounce. Her book is a work of speculative fabulation, I think, as opposed to the very real problems that have stayed with us. Her book demands the reader to stay close to her, believing in and trusting her project and understanding her inventive use of language, which is deployed, as one reviewer put it, like an after-dinner conversation after a few glasses of wine. Well, we're before dinner and before a few glasses of wine, so I hope to speak with a bit more clarity than perhaps Donna Haraway writes. So just to sort of set the scene, we're in Southwark here, where the poverty rate is currently at 31%, which is above the London average of 27%. The unemployment ratio is about 6.5%, which is the highest rate in London. Infant mortality and premature mortality are above the London average in Southwark. Now, relative child poverty in the UK is currently around 30% of children. That's 4.1 million children living in poverty in the United Kingdom. And this percentage is expected to rise to 37% by 4 years' time. Now, 10 years ago, it was under 22%, with 2.8 million children living in poverty. Now, this isn't just happening in the UK. Poverty has doubled in most Nordic countries, the countries famous for their welfare states and so on. I use these figures as a starting point and perhaps a reality check, but also to begin a discussion of the academic and professional context in which social design operates. Now, my talk's got three parts. It's really sort of past, present and future, I suppose. Past in terms of problems which have stayed with us and how they've been dealt with in a way. Thinking about the present and how the sort of rolling out of history takes us to this present. And then thinking about the future, where I begin to sort of mansplain what I think a social design institute might do. So I want to start with this book, which was published 40 years ago in 1979 by Peter Townsend, not the guitarist. And in it, he coined this very famous, now globally used definition of poverty, in which he describes as individuals, families and groups in the population can be said to be in poverty when they lack resources to obtain the type of diet, participate in the activities and have the living conditions and amenities which are customary, or at least widely encouraged and approved, in the societies in which they belong. Now, in his book, his combination of statistical analysis and narrative inquiry definitely shows the connections between wage structures and how poverty is lived in everyday life. Within this, his attention to the relationship to objects and environments runs deep. It also forms a radical shift in how poverty was conceived, turning attention away from poverty as an absolute measure of income to a relative one about the material means required for participation in society and in personal and family dignity and stability. Townsend's work included researching, for example, when housewives bought their last warm coat, when parents missed out on a cooked meal or go to bed early to save heating fuel, children wear plimsolls to school because they cannot afford winter shoes. And I think the work of Peter Townsend is hugely overlooked in design. His work is also interesting from a historical point of view, as it shows a number of things about academic practices of the time. Now, Peter Townsend initially trained as a social anthropologist and wrote on social planning as well as policy and cultural issues in the 1960s. His work was very well known to Richard Hogarth, who was then director of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham. Poverty in the United Kingdom was published in 1979 at the end of a long decade of activist turns in the social sciences and humanities, including the consolidation of post-Marxist materialist concerns in anthropology and cultural studies, and of course the growth of feminist studies, and within which the wages for housework movement came out through the International Feminist Collective. It might be taken to represent a material turn long before the material turn was claimed in the social sciences and humanities. And one of Peter Townsend's first jobs was as research secretary of the Social Services Research Section of Political and Economic Planning, and then research officer at the Institute of Community Studies at the London School of Economics. He worked on both social planning, which involved design. He wrote about a dozen articles in the journal Planning, and policy and cultural issues in these jobs before moving to the newly formed Social Administration Department at the LSE. He was a lifelong Fabian and worked with many others in the late 1950s and early 60s, determined to build and extend the welfare state. So he was very closely connected, for example, to Paul Thompson, who wrote Architecture, Art or Social Service, asking these questions about what is architecture for. I'm indebted, by the way, to Professor Dave Gordon, Director of the Townsend Centre for International Poverty Research at the University of Bristol, for this background information. In 1957, Townsend was the first academic appointment to Richard Titmus's Department of Social Administration, as we've just heard, and Roy Parker was the second appointment. They worked together on a wide range of planning issues which involved design. So, for example, Peter Townsend's seminal study of the family of old people in 1957 led directly to the development of sheltered housing, and Roy Parker's work led to the establishment of social services departments in local authorities. And Roy Parker himself was also a key appointment to the Milton Keynes Development Corporation, where he helped to design and build Milton Keynes Newtown. Now, I use this example of Peter Townsend to illustrate a number of issues that I think are pertinent to how one might think about an Institute of Social Design. Firstly, note the attention that poverty in the UK gives to expressing poverty not in terms of abstract financial terms, but in terms of material participation. Poverty, in his famous and still used definition, is about ability to participate in society. It is context relevant and is therefore about access to the material means to achieve this participation. It brushes up alongside how one might define social design. Secondly, note the fluidity of these people between scholarly disciplines, but also between their academic work and public sector practices, that perhaps also opened onto versions of social design in that time. Now, of course, the organisational context of universities was very different then, leading to a distinct culture of scholarly practices. So, in 1960, 22,000 students got an undergraduate degree in the whole of UK, and you've got more graduates in University of Arts, haven't you? Last year, 419,000 students obtained an undergraduate degree. The academic world was much, much smaller in 1960. Academics had time to read each other's work, and even their own. Engage in debate, enjoy their jobs for life with tenure, and so on. Now, dealing with a need for fluidity between stakeholders, collaborators and researchers in the very different conditions that we live with today, more students, less time to read each other's work, more audit, but also a very different social and welfare landscape, is a point I'll come back to later. But I want to make a third point, which has three sub-points about the history here. One is to note that poverty in the UK was the combination of 2 decades of work. It was the fruit of slow-moving, detailed research that nonetheless wove in and out of Townsend's other practices as an academic. Second, those 2 decades represented 20 years of continued construction of the British welfare state. More broadly, one should note the proliferation of various versions of social and sustainable design activities and important publications that were going on, particularly in the 1970s. Community architecture, design for need, design for the real world, permaculture, small is beautiful, and so on. The third point is that the publication in 1979 of Poverty in the UK also coincided with a turning point for the welfare state in Britain that has huge implications for how we conceive of social design today. So we're into the second part of my talk. It's going nicely quickly. And I want to consider this notion of different forms of social. The work of Townsend that I've been describing this far may be read to coincide with an era of what Norja Maris has termed old social. Old conceptions of the social might incorporate more stable, longer-term contexts of its use in public life, such as in social housing or social welfare. Now, more recently, there's been a rise of a new form of social, as in social media, social marketing, social innovation, social enterprise, and so on, that disrupts any feeling of stability around the term. Here the social is not necessarily taken as a given, but may at times be ephemeral and performative. We have not only experienced the fragmentation of our daily lives, but it is useful to see where this is caused. And one of the causes is in the massive restructuring of state provision of public services that have changed our kind of conceptions of what the state is and perhaps what public life is. So since the 1980s, the welfare state has been under progressive ways of dismantling. Not just in the UK, this is a process which is actually still underway, was very much underway where I live in Finland as well. Now, this began with a shift from public administration to this idea of new public management. In new public management, there's a requirement to achieve best value in order to ensure that contributions made through taxation are spent prudently. This means the pursuit of continuous improvement in the way public sector functions are exercised. Thus, performance measurement and ratings, responsiveness to public demand, and contracting out to competitive tendering gradually became features that the culture of public services were pushed closer to the private sector. So to give one anecdotal example here, this is what running a school was like when my mother was a teacher in the 1970s. Basically, you had the local education authority who did all the work of procurement, looking after the buildings, payroll, school transport, and so on. When she became a deputy head of a primary school into the 1980s, her work was more like this, having to interact with all kinds of sort of outsourced organisations, non-governmental organisations, charity works, agencies, all kinds of, whole sort of constellation of other providers in this system of competitive tendering for services. So with austerity, much of this entrepreneurial model remains, although in different formats and with different political economies depending where you look. At one end, welfare provision these days is dominated by large corporations such as Capita and G4S, with complicated outsourcing arrangements. But as we have seen recently, there have been some brave and visionary municipalities that have moved away from such models to relocalise their service provision. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go online and listen to Underworld's Sonia Mode, which includes homages to places like Whitney, Granby, Rochdale, Preston, where such experiments of relocalising service provision are happening. Apparently Underworld play this kind of repetitive beat music, which young people listening to on their gramophone records. And the song goes on to talk about procuring organic food, maker spaces, workers' co-ops, guerrilla localism, community land trusts. But I also recommend you read Aditya Chakraborty's report in The Guardian and his involvement with this. So these are kind of new spaces for experimentation. And places for experimentation haven't just opened up in the UK. This has been very much a theme in Finland. And it provided the framework for the Everyday Experiments exhibition, which I was commissioner of for the Triennale di Milano. To take a short diversion, putting this exhibition together threw up the challenge of representation and communication in social design. How do you tell the stories of projects that are about experiments which are in situ, at scale, which are the work of organisations, communities and individuals that exist at multiple contexts, but also that the projects themselves reveal contradictions within themselves and between each other? There isn't a magical curatorial answer to this. This problem of representation of social design is just one of those that we have to stay with. We have to keep putting this other message out as a form of attrition through various means. A further problem to stay with is how we deal with the project nature of design in the social design context. Now, the fragmentation of service provision that I spoke of earlier results in a more project-oriented framework of governance. This tension between austerity economics and delivering services has led to a downloading of state responsibility for welfare and for tackling inequalities to the more localised settings of cities, communities and citizens. In other words, austerity is where the state steps back and says, sorry folks, we haven't got enough money, you sort it out, but you can experiment a bit whilst you're trying to sort this out. So this change of scale also entails a breaking of the social contract of the Keynesian welfare state that was previously held at national level, introducing instead a different locus of experimentalism in policy and implementation. Rather than being held at the regulated state level of accountability, in neoliberal governance, tackling inequalities becomes the responsibility of changing a multifarious collections of local government departments, NGOs, community organisations and other entities. And in this process of downloading, it is not surprising to find design activities fashioning local responses to austerity and problem solving. They play the role not just of addressing societal challenges, but additionally of producing cost savings for hard-pressed municipalities or welfare organisations. In response to the challenges of falling welfare budgets, therefore, social design consultancies and researchers have positioned themselves in developing innovative ways of restructuring state-citizen relationships while promising cost savings. One might argue that this opens new opportunities for experimenting and innovating, new possibilities for design to be centred into the everyday shaping and running of public life. Now, Ezio Manzini, who we all know and love, in his new book, The Politics of the Everyday, goes further to argue for a locally connected and collaborative forms of civic or community action. This, in his view, allows for new political identities to be formed in the context of a reflexive and detraditionalised society. His vision is of a project-oriented society that even goes beyond current notions of what may still just still exist in a welfare state. It acknowledges the slow, hard work needed to create resilient collaborations that may exist beyond the state and beyond the corporate framings of neoliberalism. In turn, these are expected to produce new social arrangements and new material contexts, and therefore a new kind of politics. Now, however, as Cameron Tonkin-wise, and you probably expect him to say this, he observes in a recent review of the book that this project orientation assumes equality of ability and power to access collaboration in projects. We cannot assume that everyone is able or willing to engage in collaboration, participation, or co-creation. To put his argument into another context, taking part in collaborative or sharing economies requires something to share or something to collaborate with. They require entry points. Now, in social design, we can be optimistic about the possibility of engaging in creative ways to forge new social and political alliances. But pessimistically, it might just be doing the work of David Cameron's austerity-driven post-welfare state big society ambitions. And we all know where that's ended up. So, what should a social design institute do? This is where I get to mansplain or guy-splain my own fantasies if I was in Lucy's job. Well, I think a social design institute can broadly do three things. Firstly, quite basically, it can design stuff. Toilet roll holders for hospitals, cross-generational housing and support systems, decent registration and representation systems for European citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in mainland Europe. Solutions that open up the imagination, speculations that reveal the impossible. A social design institute can also model stuff, and it can understand and explore proposals for new economic arrangements, new structures of care, new forms of mobility and immobility relationships, new interrelationships of wilding and housing. It can explore the ideas created by others, such as pressure groups, think tanks, research centres, political organisations, wildlife federations, and so on. And then explore what these proposals might look like. What are their material everyday implications? Rather like Rebecca Early was talking earlier about this circular economy in King Street and what would that look like? What other articulations of people, plants, animals, infrastructures, organisations, objects or temporalities do these suggest? And then they can turn these proposals into prefigurations where realities are demonstrated or tested. In other words, it's saying, look, we have this vision of an alternative future, but relax, it's going to be okay. It looks like this and it's pretty good. Thirdly, a social design institute might develop stuff. And this is where personally I get most excited by the ambition of what social design can do. It can work with those pressure groups, think tanks, research centres, political organisations, and wildlife federations and so on, in the development of their very proposals, such that their material implications become embedded into that process. It rearranges the order of deliberation. It allows for a closer feedback process between different collaborators and stakeholders, and even for the surfacing of hitherto unknown or unforeseen human and material consequences. So some of you might have noticed the release today of the Exponential Roadmap report, which is a report put together by, I think, 39 global scientists of how we might engage with the Paris Agreement and how we can actually put this into practice. And within that, they argue for strong civil social movements, which are needed to reduce carbon emissions by 9 billion tonnes per year by 2030. And they argue that the social movements are the ones who are going to, social and civic movements are the ones who are going to put pressure on government and corporations. One might ask, well, that's perhaps why we elect governments to put that pressure on, but that's another argument. But I'm kind of interested in, well, if these scientists have got these great plans, why not engage with social design researchers in developing those plans and kind of iteratively actually model them and create the policy around that process. So if I may give a more focused example, there's a group of social scientists and policymakers have pushed for a new economic structure called the foundational economy. Their thinking separates the finance-dominated sector from the entrepreneurial and routine sectors. The latter is taken to involve goods and services that are necessary for basic functioning in everyday life, such as food, healthcare, energy, or transport. And this is what they deem to mean the foundational economy. Now, their proposal is that these should be protected through social licensing of firms who are engaged in these areas. This would include, for instance, commitments to training, accessibility, and environmental impacts. This very simple starting point has profound implications for systems such as food production and distribution or energy generation and supply. There would be undoubted effects outside the foundational economy as entrepreneurial activities have become more concentrated into non-mundane areas of everyday life. Now, a practice of social design might have a role in helping to define what these are and how they might operate. The concept of the foundational economy was developed mostly within a centre for research for socio-cultural change in the UK, well, Manchester precisely. The idea was subsequently explored in real life through a challenge fund in Wales, where in 2019 invitations have been made by the regional government for experimental projects that test the concept in real life. Now one wonders how it might have been different or presented differently if the foundational economy concept had been formed in collaboration with a range of other specialists, including those in design. Would this have allowed for deeper prototyping and shaping prior to rolling it out into experimental platforms? There's potential, perhaps, for exploring the real material implications that may add luster and nuance to it, while also allowing for more robust expectations in terms of how it might be implemented. Furthermore, one might be able to explore more deeply the processes that are required to move towards preferred situations. And this requires slow, steady, considered research, lengthy discussions, seeking novel methods and bureaucracies that hold and nurture collaborations. It also requires a commitment to committing, to staying with the problem, understanding resistances to its processing and seeing it through. Now, I've spent decades listening to students, practitioners and researchers claiming that design must, people need to, we should, the sector has to, and so on. This disembodying of the field, however, loses any sense of design being made up of its institutions, people and infrastructures. We might instead ask, what processes of change do you think can take place here and now? And how are you going to enact them? What are the hindering power interests, technological biases, financial priorities and routinized ingrained practices that stop this actually happening? How might our understanding of our position in history help here? This also requires an attunement to which social we are talking about. Now, I've built some of this talk around this notion of an old and new social. There are plenty of others that could be discussed, but time doesn't permit to go into other versions of social. For the time being, I think it is as well to remember that the old social of Peter Townsend's day hasn't gone away. There are still questions to be addressed here of social housing, not far from here, social welfare and participation in society. This last one, as we have learnt from Townsend, is a vital question in considering poverty. And indeed, I'd argue that in attempting to deal with the old social problem of poverty, indeed, I'd argue that there's been an attempt to deal with the old social problem of poverty with a sort of new social lens and with new social tools, namely the universal credit, which has been, I would say, a disastrous experiment. And sometimes experiments, I think, can be rolled out as an excuse for actually very poor policy. So layered onto this old social these days is this new social that presents further political questions. This world of new social can also be a breathless, competitive and stressful place where demands for impact, effectivity and output can dominate. Staying with a problem also involves time to read each other's work, engage in debate and build slow-moving, meaningful working relationships within and crucially beyond the university. Now, the Social Design Institute has an imaginative and ambitious plan that takes the University of Arts London to new levels of inter- and cross-disciplinary research. Now, while we can't turn back the clock, we can still take notice of those values of critique, curiosity and care that have coursed through earlier initiatives. And I wish the Social Design Institute all the best in achieving these and other things. Thank you very much.